Hello everyone, today I'm going to be changing out the fuel lines on my 1968 Volkswagen Karmann Ghia. One of the lines that was going into the fuel pump started to leak, so I'm going to swap out all the lines in the engine bay and the line that leads through the rear left wheel well. We're going to switch out all those. I'm going to show you how to do that. I'm going to change the location of where my fuel filter is as well. And if anyone has any recommendations or suggestions about where that fuel filter should be, please put them in the comments. I know there's a lot of debate about where it should be, whether you even need one. So I'd like to hear your feedback on that as well. If you like this video, please like and subscribe my channel to follow along with my adventures on fixing up this Karmann Ghia. A couple notes before we start. I am not a mechanic, so part of this series is proving that you can do a lot of these things yourself in your garage. These cars are generally considered pretty easy to work on. That's why people love them, and that's why there's still so many on the road today. Now, since we were dealing with fuel lines, I do want to point out a small disclaimer. With me today, I do have a fire extinguisher ready to go, just in case the worst were to happen, because you never know. I'm going to start up this car toward the end of the video, and I want to make sure nothing bad happens when I do that, just in case. Like I said, I'm not a mechanic, so take everything I'm doing as a grain of salt. Use it as a reference, but again, this is not definitive advice. Seek your mechanic if you have any concerns and your ability to do this correctly. Thank you and enjoy. Now, I've already taken off one fuel hose that came from the fuel filter over to the fuel pump output. I took that off in the process of diagnosing what the issue was. This is the point that started leaking. You can see this is very clean from the gasoline that leaked across it. So this part's already been removed. I posted a picture recently on Facebook of the location of my fuel filter and got a lot of feedback about this not being the correct place. Apparently a lot of VW dealerships back in the day used to put these here because the cars didn't come from the factory with any sort of fuel filter, but because of where they are in relation to the distributor, people had concerns about catching on fire. I'm sure there have been a couple of cases of them leaking or not being secured properly and cars catching on fire, but a lot of people say that it's kind of more of an urban legend. If you stay up on it and make sure it's not leaking, you're not really going to have an issue. All the hoses that were in here were attached by these clamps, so I've already loosened a couple of these. My intention is to not use these when I put them back on, though I do have a set, so if I see any leaking after all this is installed, I can put these on after, but it seems like the new 5mm by 2.5mm hoses are very tight along the fittings, so I'm not too worried about them leaking without these fittings. And it seems like if you get the correct German-made braided hoses, you don't have to use the clamps. I guess this is an aftermarket thing that didn't come from the factory that way. So, as of right now, I have the hard line coming in this side to a hose that runs to the fuel pump input, fuel pump output running through a fuel filter, and then up through a hose into the carburetor. What I'm about to do is put the fuel filter inside the left rear wheel well soft fuel hose, which we'll get to shortly, and get it out of the engine bay completely to alleviate any concerns of that being a source of leaking fuel in the engine bay itself. Having already loosened these wires, I'm going to go ahead and pull off the fuel line coming into the carburetor from the fuel filter. Remove that. You can see this filter is not in very good shape, especially compared to a brand new one that I had delivered from J-Bugs. Big difference there. So that should make, I don't know if I'll notice a difference or not, but at least it'll look better. Get that out of the way. I'm also going to take off the hose that goes into the fuel pump from the hard line. You'll notice there's no gas coming out. I've already drained these because, like I said, I've already had them off and looked at them to diagnose exactly what all I needed to replace, so they're good for now. When I go to take the one off inside the wheel well when I get there, I will have an oil catch pan underneath just so I don't have gas leaking all over my garage floor, because we don't want that. I have two lengths of German-made braided fuel hose that I'll be installing, probably this one first as it's shorter. I got 6 feet here and 10 feet here. Initially ordered the 10 feet from J-Bugs, but they were back ordered, and I want to get this car back on the road. I don't like it sitting in the garage and not be able to take it out on the weekend. So I found that Airhead Parts had some in stock, ordered from them, got it first, and then 2 days later, of course, my shipment from J-Bugs comes. So now I know I have extra fuel line if I need it, but this will probably be sitting on the shelf for a while and hopefully it doesn't dry rot on me. So I'll be using this first. use the shorter length, and I'm going to start cutting to length to be able to figure out where I want to run it and get it away from everything so it's not in the way of anything else that's going to be running through the engine bay. To do this part, I'm going to work backwards from the engine itself, so the carburetor. I'm going to clean up these cuts with a set of pliers that have cutters in them. Something simple anyone has laying around their garage without getting some specific tool for this. I'm going to work, like I said, from the carburetor first, so this being the correct size line slides over these fittings very tightly, I've found. Just kind of work it on there until it's nice and tight. I'll come back and tighten that up a little bit. Now I'm going to run it where I want that line to sit. Which includes underneath the wiring for the ignition there. So that's going to come straight from the fuel pump output. So I'm going to run around the bottom here and come in through there. So now that I have my measured out, cut that piece. Go onto my fuel pump output. You can see how tight that is. I noticed there's 5mm and 7mm options. I did get a foot of 7mm at first from a third source, but it fit on pretty loosely. So you can see on these fuel filters, it looks like you could take the 5mm or 7mm lines. 5mm seems to sit tight on here, and that 7mm did sit tight on this part. But the 5mm, everything else is 5mm in there. So it seems to make more sense to go that route. So I have that run. Now before I had that fuel filter in this section, which seems like a silly place to put it. I'd rather have the fuel filter before the fuel got to the fuel pump myself. Makes way more sense to me. But working backwards again, clean up this end of this. Make sure I don't lose track of that piece in the engine bay. Go around the back here to get it onto the fuel pump inlet side. There we go. Now to be able to get my hand in there a little bit easier to get to that fuel filter or fuel pump input side, I'm going to pop off my distributor cap, lay that right there. Then I'm able to get my hand further in there and get that fuel line a little bit tighter on there. This obviously pops off real easy, so I'll put that back on. Same orientation. Pop those back on. And that's good to go. So now I got my fuel pump input. I'm going to measure out how far I need this to go to get to the hard line, the hard body line, fuel lines. About that far, a little bit of slack. Trim that, and this left on the 6-foot spool should be plenty to do that part up underneath or behind the left rear wheel. Right underneath my battery cable. Slide that over the hard line. Now, as I mentioned, all these fittings are tight enough that I'm not particularly worried about leaks, even without the clamps, though I did get a set just in case I wanted to go back and change that in the end. So now I have carburetor around down to the fuel pump output, and then the fuel pump input around the back side of the distributor over to that hard line that goes underneath the chassis, or through the chassis underneath the body. Alright, now we're up behind that rear left wheel. You're looking between the shock and this brace. So here's our fuel line mount here. I'm going to try to work free. I'm going to try some pliers to see if I can loosen that up around the steel line. There, it seems like it's loosening up a little bit. And I do have a oil catch underneath this, since I'm expecting some fuel to come out of this one. There it is. Let that run down. So if you'll notice, this piece of the body, or the piece of the frame here, is pretty nasty. I recently replaced the swing axle boots. I did not realize when I towed the car home that both swing axle boots were torn, so I had some gear oil flying out of there the whole way home, not knowing it until I got it home. So I still have to get in and clean that up with a washer of some kind. Now we got that one loose. So I'm going to zip tie that onto another line back there. We'll try to get a better angle. Now this may not be the best view, but it's about the best I can do. But essentially I gotta take the fuel line off this other end that runs through the bodywork into the engine bay. Luckily that one's already a little bit looser. And the fuel's already drained out. So now we have that line out. It's time to cut a couple more pieces and then add the fuel filter in there as well. I've cut this small 6-inch piece of fuel line. I'm going to work on my fuel filter. Like I said, it's nice and snug around that narrower section. That's nice and tight on there now. And now we're going to make that back up to the steel line that runs through the body, really the firewall, not so much the body. Get that nice and tight on there. I'm going to cut another 6-inch or so piece. I'll make this about 8 or 9 inches. Just eyeballing it. Work that on the other end of the fuel filter here. The input end. Again, making sure it's nice and snug because I don't want to have to pull my wheel off again if I see this is leaking. That should be nice and tight on there. Now back to our previous angle. I'm going to work that back onto here. Again, snug it down quite a little ways. About half an inch or so. Just make sure it's nice and tight. And that's it. And that should be, in my opinion, a better place to put that fuel filter and to get it out of the engine bay. Alright, looks good. Looks like we have no leaks at any of those points. Looks like a job done for today. Now that we're all done with this project, please again subscribe to my channel so you can follow along with this project. Looking at doing some seat belts here in the near future. I'm going to put the 3-point harnesses in for a little bit more modern safety features. And I have some other things coming with this car as well. So subscribe, like this video, help me out, follow along. And again, like I said earlier, if you have feedback, please put them in the comments below. Thank you for your time.